실천하고 있는 동탄 왕코입니다. 오늘부터 오후 출근이에요. 2주 동안. 지금 난리죠. 대한민국이 이태원에서 시작된 코로나 때문에. 졸려. 다들 코로나 조심하세요.
Deal with the threat here in the United States.
In the final days of January, a World Health Organization emergency committee praised the Chinese government's leadership, commitment to transparency, and saw no need for any travel or trade restriction. And Trump again told the country everything was fine.
We think we have it very well under control.
So the very next day after the president made those comments in Michigan was when his administration declared the coronavirus outbreak a public health emergency.
In China, the doctor reprimanded for sounding the alarm was dying after being infected by a patient.
Struggling to communicate, Lee spoke with CNN briefly by phone. You can hear the hospital machines pulsing in the background.
China's Supreme Court commented that if Lee's warning a month earlier had been heeded and action taken, quote, it might have been a fortunate thing for containing the new coronavirus. Next.
Once we saw that this outbreak grew exponential rates, we knew this was going to be a rapidly disseminating virus.
Their hearts just sink when they're trying to use this test and it's malfunctioning.
The coronavirus pandemic has changed the world, the way we live, work, and play.
Okay, let's do some quick draws.
As countries and companies join together to find creative and essential solutions to combat the virus.
We look at the innovations being designed and used to protect lives.
Public health needs to modernize the approach that they're taking.
These are the technologies that will shape our world well beyond the pandemic.
Inventing Tomorrow, tonight on CNN.
The English Premier League may be out of action for the foreseeable future, but that doesn't mean the clubs and players aren't keeping busy during the coronavirus pandemic. Chelsea Football Club have announced their plans to donate 78,000 meals to medical workers within the UK's National Health Service, as well as charities who are supporting those most vulnerable to the virus. The free meals will be distributed every day for 6 weeks. Meanwhile, in the United States, NBA star James Harden has teamed up with national grocery chain Kroger to provide a week's worth of groceries to 5,000 families in the Houston, Texas area. The selected families impacted by the pandemic will receive a combination of fresh meats, bread, milk, produce, and staple canned goods. For more information on how you can help during this pandemic, go to cnn.com/impact.
It's a vicious virus that spreads easily, and a recent study shows the virus that causes COVID-19 can survive on surfaces for hours, even days. The results published in the New England Journal of Medicine say that COVID-19 can hang out as droplets and remain in the air for up to 3 hours. The study found that the novel coronavirus can survive up to 4 hours on copper, up to 24 hours on cardboard, and 2 to 3 days on plastic and stainless steel. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention continue to recommend the cleaning of frequently touched surfaces and objects every day. The CDC recommends diluted bleach solutions, 5 tablespoons of bleach per gallon of water, and alcohol solutions with at least 70% alcohol. The agency says most household cleaners or disinfectants should be effective too.
My name is Louise Mills. I am a qualified primary school teacher from Ireland, and I was living in Australia working as a casual relief teacher, which is otherwise known as a substitute teacher. Unfortunately, myself and my boyfriend, we decided we had to leave Melbourne because government wasn't doing anything to support people on visas in Australia. It meant for us that we had to make a decision whether or not to take a risk of staying without any real guarantee of work in the future, or I suppose the safer option of coming home. We just felt like we didn't really have much of a choice because of not knowing what was going to happen in the coming months and weeks, and not knowing how long this was going to go on for.
February began with a ban.
Not one person has died, and I issued a travel restriction from China.
The restriction stopped most Chinese residents and foreign nationals who had recently been in China from traveling to the U.S. The restrictions also started a clock.
When you talk to public health experts, they really look with despair at those couple of weeks because they say, whatever your feelings were on the travel ban at the time, it was a perfectly fine and reasonable step to take, and he bought himself a little bit of time, and then he just squandered it.
There were only 9 known cases of the novel coronavirus inside the U.S. The first step to keeping that number low, according to the experts, was a working test for the virus.
Testing was, is, and always will be the cornerstone of trying to stem a pandemic. You've got to identify the people who are infected, you've got to be able to isolate those folks, and you've got to be able to treat them. It all begins with testing.
February 6th is when the CDC starts sending these test kits out to public health departments.
But the tests, the only tests approved for use in the United States, were not working.
Their hearts just sink when they're trying to use this test and it's malfunctioning.
There was a test available from the World Health Organization, but the CDC did not choose to get it. And nobody inside the government asked outside labs to help.
Officials were told not to do it, that they did not need to do it, it was too alarmist.
The delay in testing concerned the experts, who now saw the virus spreading from human to human, and quickly.
I think it was pretty clear in early February that there was human-to-human contact.
Once we saw that this outbreak grew exponential rates, we knew this was going to be a rapidly disseminating virus.
Researcher Eva Lee was working to figure out how many Americans might catch the virus.
We build mathematical models.
Those models projected that between 2 and 10 million people in the U.S. would become infected. On February 9th, she sent an email to that Red Dawn chain of public health experts, calling for social distancing.
We need the citizens to know and practice social distancing in a way that best protects them. Every action counts.
It was a full 5 weeks later before President Trump would take that step.
Thank you very much.
That same day, some of the nation's governors met with Dr. Anthony Fauci and CDC Director Robert Redfield. They got some disturbing news.
They gave us a pretty detailed outline of what they felt was happening with this virus. We knew that this was going to be a serious crisis.
It was exactly the opposite of what President Trump was saying publicly.
Looks like by April, in theory, when it gets a little warmer, it miraculously goes away.
The president's CDC director contradicted him later that week in an interview with Dr. Sanjay Gupta.
I think this virus is probably with us beyond this season or beyond this year, and I think eventually the virus will find a foothold.
Very small number of people in the country right now with it. It's like around 12. Many of them are getting better. Some are fully recovered already. So we're in very good shape.
He was still of the view that you could stop flights, build walls, and keep coronavirus from coming to the United States.
The chances of that were near zero, partly because it was now more than 2 weeks since the CDC test had been approved, and it still was not working properly.
Over at the White House, Robert Redfield, who's the director of the CDC, and Alex Azar, Secretary of Health and Human Services, are assuring other administration officials we're going to get it fixed quickly.
Not quickly enough. February 22nd, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, sent an expert to the CDC headquarters to help figure out the problem.
This expert realized that there was contamination in the manufacturing process and that the CDC had actually violated its own manufacturing protocols in trying to produce this test, and that is why the tests were malfunctioning.
You have to wonder if President Trump had been directly involved or his staff had, and if they had understood that you only contain the virus if you understand its spread, they might have pressed for more widespread testing earlier.
A little bit to their defense here, there were certainly indications that it was going to be bad, that it was going to spread, but there was no clear data, even in mid-February, on exactly how it was spreading through the United States.
But during the third week of February, public health officials were preparing for the worst, just in case.
They gathered in the Situation Room to run a tabletop exercise of what it would look like if the pandemic fully hit the United States. And so while the president was talking about 15 cases going to zero, they were talking about 15 cases going to the thousands, and then the tens of thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands.
2 days later, Dr. Robert Cadlick, an assistant secretary for preparedness at the Department of Health and Human Services, spotted a Red Dawn email that set off warning bells in the administration.
This is really a critical moment for this group that's studying the problem. They see an email about a patient in China who had shown no symptoms of coronavirus and yet had spread the virus to family and friends.
That means people who did not know they were sick were unknowingly spreading the virus. Eva, is this true? Dr. Cadlick wrote to Eva Lee. If so, we have a huge hole on our screening and quarantine effort. She responded with a link confirming the story and added,
Simply, people are carrying the virus everywhere.
That then sets in motion a greater urgency from the group that they've got to get to the president a plan to mitigate the problem inside the United States before it spreads further.
It was now February 24th, and it was time, Dr. Cadlick and his colleagues decided, to tell President Trump he needed to recommend social distancing measures, including shutting down big public events and schools. But President Trump was in India.
They planned basically the moment he got back to the United States, they were going to sit down with him, advocate for these measures, and hopefully try to convince the president to move forward with it. But one thing happened. A doctor from the CDC, Dr. Messonnier, got ahead of the messaging that they had been working on internally and warned publicly that there was going to be a severe disruption to American life.
We are asking the American public to work with us to prepare in that expectation that this could be bad.
The president was angry about that and said, why are they overplaying the problem? It's leading to the stock market crashing.
Breaking news. The Dow is taking a dramatic hit, down almost 900 points. President Trump actually considered firing Dr. Messonnier, according to the Wall Street Journal, though he ultimately did not.
The president had been less concerned with what the warning sounded like and more concerned with the content of the warning. He might have concluded the CDC was right and moved much more quickly to trying to mitigate the effects, trying to prepare the American people.
Instead, the day the president returned from India, he blamed the media, tweeting that MSNBC and CNN are, quote, doing everything possible to make the coronavirus look as bad as possible, including panicking markets if possible, unquote. Before railing at the media, the president was angry with Dr. Messonnier. The president, it seemed, viewed anyone delivering ugly facts about the virus as the enemy. That evening, he held a presser and said something completely opposite from what his experts were saying.
When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, that's a pretty good job we've done.
The president also announced a new leader of the coronavirus task force.
I'm going to be putting our Vice President, Mike Pence, in charge.
On that day the president returned from India, Dr. Cadlick and his colleagues did not tell the president it was time to start social distancing. It would be nearly 3 more weeks before the president took any of the steps they had planned to recommend.
I think one of the big questions we're always going to have is what would have happened if we had acted sooner? If we had started these physical distancing measures a week earlier, the question will be asked, how many lives would have been saved? According to some models, they say, 50, 60% of people within that first wave may not have become infected.
If you had a process that was ongoing and you started mitigation earlier, you could have saved lives. Obviously, no one is going to deny that. But what goes into those kinds of decisions is complicated.
So in late February, the president was still holding crowded rallies. His administration had not yet recommended social distancing, and they had not solved the problem with the testing kits. Then on February 27th, a breakthrough in the form of a phone call arranged by Dr. Anthony Fauci.
He wants the other health experts on the line, and the message when they all get on the line is we are not getting off this phone call until we figure out how to fix the testing issue. And you have the head of the FDA on this call, you have Redfield on this call, and it's really striking that this isn't happening until the end of February. But one of the solutions that comes out of it is the FDA needs to loosen its regulations.
That was a big deal. Those regulations made it difficult for commercial labs to come into the process and scale up testing. The regulations were officially lifted on the last day of February. Coming up.
Anybody that wants a test can get a test.
And that was a surprise to people at the CDC.
The Profit Point, in association with Dan Gote.
We are a conduit. What we try to do is take a technology and commercialize this, making it fully commercial, not subject to any subsidies, not subject to any support from anybody. My name is Chris Antonopoulos. I'm the CEO of the Killer Power.
You guys say that you're a pure renewable energy play. How so?
Absolutely, yes. If you look currently in Africa, 600 million people, half of the population is without access to power. Number two, if you look at the penetration of renewable power in Africa, it's only single-digit percentages of the total mix, 5 or 6%. And now, if you couple this with the fact that costs for renewable power has come dramatically down over the last couple of years, means that as a matter of fact, for most of the countries, renewable power is the cheapest power available, particularly in Africa, which, as we all know, has an abundance of natural resources with solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, etc. So for us, it is a land of opportunity indeed.
Are all your projects profitable? Are you
Projects are profitable.
And you're making money on them? And
renewables is a profitable business.
My name is Emmanuel Ahimieho. I'm the project manager of Bandana Kaba Road. We don't need to import anything that we need on the road. They are all locally available materials. So people from the community, they end up becoming suppliers. I think it has brought life back to the communities. And to be able to lead those people to achieve something worthwhile, something that is of value, I feel extremely proud.
Coronavirus. To get daily news updates in your inbox, sign up for the CNN newsletter. Coronavirus. Fact versus fiction.
Business is all about making connections. But some connections are easier to make than others. With a CNN partner hotel, the world is always at your fingertips. CNN partner hotels, connected to your world.
In London, and this is CNN.
2 months Months after the Trump administration first learned of the contagion taking over the globe, there were 72 known cases in the U.S. and 1 known death. But that was about to change.
March was an explosive month for this virus in the United States.
New evidence confirmed that the virus, after entering Washington state and California, was now spreading on the East Coast, with the first reported infection in New York. And 2 days later, a second.
We're seeing what we expected, what we anticipated, which was a continuing spread.
In a few short weeks, New York State's second case of COVID multiplied into hundreds, forming the nation's newest cluster.
We will continue to do exactly what we're doing.
But back in Washington, D.C., the president had yet to publicly admit the enormity of the unfolding crisis.
A lot of very exciting things are happening, and they're happening very rapidly.
The month before, in February, a team inside Trump's own administration had developed an aggressive plan to try to slow the spread of the virus through social distancing, a plan that would effectively shut down a big chunk of the nation's economy. But President Trump was still resisting.
So this is a critical period of time where the coronavirus continues to spread and no real federal action is taken.
States began competing for critical medical supplies and equipment. Come mid-March, supplies would become so scarce, the CDC would issue guidelines to healthcare workers to reuse masks, or even use bandanas if necessary.
That was unthinkable before that point. No one in a million years would ever have thought that in the United States of America that we would tell doctors and nurses, reuse your mask.
Part of the problem in terms of the PPE is that there has been a total lack of clarity about process here. Mike Pence took over the task force. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, has been running what some have described as a shadow task force. That has left a lot of confusion as to who exactly is responsible for helping procure PPE.
Confusion that would continue to plague the administration behind closed doors and in front of the cameras.
We're considering different things, but we're also considering the fact that last year you had approximately 36,000 deaths due to what's called the flu.
So the president visits the CDC and famously says, anybody who wants to test
can get a test.
And that was a surprise to people at the CDC who were working on this issue. They didn't know the president was going to say that. Testing was certainly not at a point where anybody who wants a test can get a test.
And the tests are all perfect. Like the letter was perfect. The transcription was perfect, right?
The tests were flawed. The test didn't work. And as a result, we lost valuable time. More people became infected. There were people walking around without any symptoms, no test, and they were continuing to spread the virus.
It will go away, just stay calm.
But the day after President Trump said the virus would, quote, go away, the country was wrestling with a new reality. Hollywood legend Tom Hanks and his wife tested positive for COVID. The NBA announced it was suspending its season.
And all of a sudden, everybody was saying, what's going on here? What's the deal with this virus?
And the World Health Organization officially named COVID-19 a pandemic.
The president was still contradicting what was actually happening.
And some of the experts I talked to said that was because the stock market was really driving the president's decision making, and he didn't want to do the kinds of things that you needed to do to mitigate the spread of this virus because it would further hurt the economy.
Pushed by Democrats to more than triple his original request for funding.
And I got 8.3, and I'll take it.
Trump signed $8.3 billion in emergency spending for the virus. Yet even then, he continued to insist, falsely, no one saw this virus coming.
Very well, but it's an unforeseen problem, not a problem. Came out of nowhere.
Every epidemiologist has been predicting, cajoling, warning government officials for the last 20 years that a pandemic